So welcome back to Russia and Europe since 1700. In this, I want to begin today where we left off last time, and to start actually because we in some sense ran out of time with the concluding section of the last lecture before launching into the big question of this lecture. I thought I would take a minute here at the beginning just to remind you of where we had arrived with our story so far, and with the larger account of Europe and Russia since 1700. To remind you also that first assignment, as I wrote you on Moodle today, is due tomorrow at midnight, and that the aim is a kind of close reading in as little as 3 sentences or as much as 3 paragraphs of either Chedayev's or Kirevsky's text in light of some of the larger themes we're talking about. But you can think of today's lecture, both the conclusion of the last one and the new one, as an opportunity to think about the larger context in which to complete this assignment. Remind you that last time we talked about 3 major themes of European history that characterize or animate the identity of Europe and to some extent Russia today. Some of these themes, can you remember what some of these might be? Sometimes I'm just going to ask you questions like this to alert you out of the slumber that takes over when we don't sort of actively sort of engage. What were some of the big themes of European and Russian history we introduced last time? What makes Europe Europe? Yeah. Feeling like you're on the periphery of civilization. Very good. What else? Christianity. That's one a large theme that unites sort of the Russian and European stories. Anything else? Modernity. Okay. Well.
More of a push to overcome this peripheral feeling.
The push to overcome this peripheral feeling, but perhaps you could put these 3 comments together. Modernity is in some sense about the attempt to overcome a sense of being peripheral, marginal, unimportant. So the big surprise, the paradox of Europe that I introduced to you last time that we don't often think about is that while the European promise of modernity is a promise of radical and unprecedented change, with key words like, I hope you wrote these 3 words down: revolution, development, democracy. Words that you can use if they're in your head all the time. They can help you complete the assignments for this class, but also think in the largest, broadest possible way about what modernity promises. It promises change. It promises revolutionary change. It promises the transformation of yourself and society, and both together. And the notion, right, that we are all responsible for ourselves and for society, and that we can create a world in which the maximum number of people can be maximally influential in shaping the destiny of the world and humanity. And ultimately what this means, this radical change that we mean by the word revolution, is development on the one hand, creating a better self, and also democracy, the empowering of a collective, the powering of all people together. And that Europe has in it, perhaps, in its, you could say its cultural DNA, a kind of optimistic faith that it's possible to put these 2 things together, that you can get development and democracy at the same time. And one thing we'll notice in the 19th century is that these are often in contradiction. The more you expand the number of voices in a society, the harder it is to direct the ship. If everybody's speaking their own mind all the time, what do you get? Not development, you get anarchy. You get chaos. You get the collapse. So the European faith is based on the notion that we can actually overcome that problem, that we can somehow achieve development without putting all power in the hands of one person. And we're constantly being disappointed in this. We'll see European history, like Russian history, is often the realization that development comes at the expense of democracy. make the voices shut up so that we can actually do something. Seems to be the way things have gone more often. Now, I concluded for you, concluded the lecture last time with this image of, or rather this clip from the film Alexander Nevsky, Stalin's favorite film, the late 1930s, where we see the clash of the Teutonic Knights and the armies of Alexander Nevsky basically on a frozen Lake Peipus, not very far from here, and perhaps one of the earliest symbolic representations of the encounter and fight between a vision of the East and a vision of the West, of Europe and Russia. It has been said, and I have said myself, the history of the world is best observed from the frontier. This was a comment here on the slide you'll see from the Catalan French historian speaking about the Pyrenees. But I would argue that we could make the same claim about our territory and our place here. And the one point I did not get to in the last lecture was in what gets hidden in plain view or lost in translation in that clash of two armies on Lake Peipus. The last Christians on the Europe-Russia frontier. So what I want to help you do too, just with this first slide here, is to think as analytically as you can about how you might approach the relationship between Russia and Europe across time and space and language, as we talked about last time. How can you imagine that relationship so that you can actually do an analysis of Chadaev's or Kirevsky's letter? One way to think about that relationship is as a mirror. Russia and Europe are mirrors to each other. And we can talk about how the self reflects the other. When you read Chadaev or Kirevsky, you might be look for reflections. What is his position as a writer? Who is he writing for? Who is he writing to? And who is he writing as? What is his own identity? We can get clues to his identity from how he writes. Does he see Europe as a reflection of himself? Or perhaps we can talk not just about the reflections of two things, but we can talk about points of view. The relationship doesn't have to be that of a mirror, how one reflects the other. It can be how one actively sees. This is already a more active relationship between self and other than that of a mirror. There are 4 points here, and they're going to apply throughout the rest of the course. It might be worth sort of thinking them through here and now. We can also talk about, in an even more complicated level, about transformation, how the self becomes or shapes the other. Because very often we'll find that the Russians we're talking about turn out to be Europeans, and the Europeans turn out to be Russian. They travel from one place to another. They change their vision of themselves. The story of Russia and Europe since the 1700s is a story of mobility and migration and self-transformation. And if modernity really is about a world where everything that is solid melts into air, transformation is at the root of it, becoming a different kind of person, creating a new kind of society. And ultimately, and lastly, perhaps we could talk about Russia and Europe in the most complicated and perhaps least satisfying sense as two intertwined worlds, mutually entangled translations of each other. Almost nothing that is said in Russian intellectual history in the 19th century is said without reference to Europe. And many of the things that are said in Europe, and this was my most provocative claim, if you remember from the last lecture, that Europe would not exist if it were not for Russia. But Russia gives Europe a kind of cultural coherence that it would not have otherwise. How else would the Portuguese and the Swedes find a common basis for identity? Because the Russians saw it first. They said, you two are similar. The Portuguese don't see themselves as similar with the Swedes. The Swedes don't see themselves as similar with the Portuguese, but the Russians do. And therefore we have a larger context in which Europe can have some kind of meaning in the world at large. The key question to ask of any text, I've written this to you, but now I want to tell you too. And the basis of any good close reading is who is saying what, to whom, and why. I'm hoping that by the end of this class, you'll ask this of every single thing you read. Perhaps it would be a little tedious to ask this of everything that you hear and say. But it's a way of discovering what is hidden in plain view and all of sort of the hidden and latent excitement in the world that we miss when we just scroll through posts online. I think this is the skill that the internet is killing. The ability to read things with this question in mind. And in some sense, recovering that skill is the most important task of the humanities, and maybe the most important task of intellectual life in the university, I think, in our modern world. We live in a world where people accept and read at face value, where they don't ask who is saying what to whom and why. That's the critical sensibility that allows you to question what you read, to wonder what its relationship is to other things that are said. Now, the point here is not simply to debunk everything that is said, to undermine it, but to figure out what positive value can be extracted from the texts you read and encounter by noticing the identity of the speaker, the identity of the addressee, the nature of the message, and the reason for which the thing is said in the first place. I'm sure you haven't thought this yet, but I'm going to provoke you to think it right now. Why did Chadaev write this in the first place? What made Chadaev write? Everything we write we write for a reason. Think about this with anything, but start with Chadaev as the assignment. What made him write this letter? People don't just sit down and write random stuff. They write to communicate something to someone. So what is that? What's the story that's lying behind these texts? So if you think of the European-Russian relationship in terms of all of these possible forms, mirrors, points of view, a relationship of transformation, a relationship of intertwined worlds, and we read the texts produced within these worlds with an eye to close reading, asking who is saying what to whom and why, we'll also find that there is a great deal that gets lost and found in the translation between the two. And one of those things are the people who lie in between, who are neither, in some sense, European nor Russian, at least when we first encounter them. And this is maybe the best way in which I think that our local environment, our place in Tartu today, helps us to see the larger questions of this course. Europe's frontier, Vasily Tatichev in 1730, Peter the Great's geographer, claimed it was the Ural Mountains. Why did he say that? Who was saying what to whom and why here? Well, he's trying to create an image of Russia that includes Europe, that in which Russia is European. That's one reason why he claims that the Ural Mountains are the frontier. But as we saw in the film Alexander Nevsky, there's also an important frontier that's much closer. The frontier that is perhaps the current frontier of the European Union. It appears on the former Estonian currency here. We have Ivangorod Fortress, built in 1492 in Russia, kind of to oppose the Narva Castle in Estonia. And this is the current border of the European Union. Picture I took on the morning of February 24th, 2011, waiting for the sunrise. In 1492, or in the 1490s at least, a German chronicler by the name of Hartmann Schedel published his Nuremberg Chronicle of the World, in which he claimed, using this kind of old, antiquated German, Livland ist die letzte Provinz und Gegend der Christen. That Livonia is the last province and territory of the Christians. Because here, in this territory that we currently occupy, were the last unconverted pagans. They were neither Russians nor Europeans, you could say, at that time. In some ways, the story of Russia and Europe is a battle for the hearts and minds of the people who lie in between, in a cultural sense. But if we look at this whole story from the perspective of the people who lie in between, and not the armies of Alexander Nevsky or the armies of the Teutonic Knights clashing on Lake Peipus, we have a very interesting question, which I think is at the root of all of European and Russian histories. How to imagine the people who say no. No to Europe. No to Russia. Are they heroes or traitors? The position of a person caught in between, I think, is ultimately one of the most universal positions in world history. We are all individually, in some sense, caught in between forces that are bigger than ourselves. It can be between people in our lives, between economic factors, between political powers. And just to make this problem come alive for you in a specific historical sense, I want to tell you the tale of two martyrs. The chieftain of the Estonian tribe of Lembitu and the chieftain of the Livonian tribe, Kaupo, both of whom died on September 24th, 1217, it is imagined. And they died fighting each other. When we look at the texts of the past, we see an attempt to claim them as one thing or the other, as heroes or traitors. One of the earliest German chronicles of the age, the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia of the 13th century, describes how Kaupo, the Livonian chieftain, was converted to Christianity. He writes, "And having traveled through a great part of Germany, Brother Theodoric brought Kaupo to Rome and presented him to the Apostolic Father. The Pope received him with great generosity, kissed him, and asked him about the conditions of the tribes that live in the vicinity of Livonia, and thanked God for the conversion of the Livonian tribe to Christianity. A few days later, Pope Innocent gave Kaupo a gift, namely 100 pieces of gold, and blessed him as he set out again for Germany, leaving him in great love with God. And by means of Brother Theodoric, he sent to the Bishop of Livonia a copy of the Bible written in the hand of the blessed Pope Gregory." Who was saying what to whom and why, for what purpose? Henry, the chronicler of Livonia, writing from the perspective of German Christianity, is telling a story about how the pagan tribes are converted to Christianity, how this is progress. This is about making the world better. They have made the right choice. Kaupo is the hero. Lembitu, who refused conversion to Christianity, is the villain in this, or the traitor to this cause. And no wonder they meet each other on a battlefield and die. But there are other monuments that can interpret this in other ways, some that lie around us. There's a famous statue here in Tartu somewhere. Hopefully you'll stumble upon it one day in walking around town. The Soviet statue of 1950, built during the Soviet era, of Vyachko and Meelis at the defense of Tartu. Meelis was the mythological son of Lembitu, a symbol kind of Estonian independence. And here he's being used, you could say, in the context of another very different cultural narrative. We have an image of the Belarusian or Russian Count Vyachko pointing his finger. And we have Meelis looking where the Count is pointing. What is he pointing at? Can you figure it out from this context? The enemies, yes? Towards west? Yeah. It could be. But he's here, well, enemies first, right? I mean, he's pointing out where Meelis should shoot. And who are the enemies? Germans, right? So this is a kind of the Russian view of how the small tribes that lay in between participate in this larger story of Russia and Europe. But this question keeps on coming up over and over again. Who do we have to ally ourselves with to be on the right side? Or can we just claim that we want to go our own way, our own path? Is that even an option? Who stands for the values that we embrace as true or good, and who for the values that we see as contradictory to everything that is important in our world? When we look at world history or European history from the perspective of the people somehow caught in between, and I don't want to simply talk about Estonians, I want to talk about everybody in Europe basically here. And this, the problem or question of who is the hero and who is the traitor or who is the villain becomes much more difficult and complicated. This is a situation we'll continually face over and over again throughout the 19th century, as we see people forced to make a choice about how to move forward into the modern world. But with that, I want to begin this lecture sort of proper. There's an extra "and" there. Sorry about that. But and I think what I just told you is a good kind of introduction to the theme or the problem of the birth of a new man and the myth of European modernity. How do we create this new world? How do we create a new person for it? Who do we have to ally ourselves with? What kind of compromises do we have to make to get there? I want to start by simply introducing you to the cultural trope of the new man as a fundamentally important European trope that goes back at least to the Renaissance, if not before. And perhaps this is the missing link from the last lecture. In the last lecture, I presented you with this idea of modernity as the optimistic belief in the possibility of infinite change and transformation and betterment, and then also Europe's congenital inferiority complex, this belief that we are marginal, on the outside, exiled from our primary language, holy languages, exiled from our primary home, Jerusalem, that we don't occupy the center of our own world. So the question became in the last lecture, how do we get from that cultural inferiority complex to this optimistic sense of the possibility of creating a new world order? How do we get from the beginning of the last millennium to this one? And that's what this lecture, in some sense, sets out to answer, looking for the origins of the answer in the idea of a new man, and with it, the myth of a European modernity. So the new man and the cultural origins of European modernity is really where I want to begin here. Now, the idea that humanity is not good enough, or that we haven't yet achieved what we need to achieve in order to create a better society and world, is very much a theme of the Italian Renaissance. In fact, you could say Jacob Burckhardt, the first great historian of the Italian Renaissance, gave voice to this problem in 1860 in his book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. He is responsible, really, for the invention of the archetype of the Renaissance man. So the context in which this was supposed to all happen, he wrote in maybe one of the most famous paragraphs in his book, was, in the Middle Ages, he claimed both sides of human consciousness, that which was turned within as that which was turned without, lay dreaming or half awake beneath a common veil. The veil was woven of faith, illusion, and childish prepossession, through which the world and history were seen clad in strange hues. Man was conscious of himself only as a member of a race, a people, a family, a corporation, only through some general category. In Italy, this veil first melted into air. An objective treatment and consideration of the state and of all the things of this world became possible. The subjective side, at the same time, asserted itself with corresponding emphasis. Man became a spiritual individual and recognized himself as such. Now, the example that Burckhardt gives us for somebody who starts to see himself not simply as the member of a nation, of a tribe, of a race, of a city, but somebody who can, as an individual, do something on his own terms, is Leon Battista Alberti, first example of a Renaissance man. He claims, he reads one of the earliest biographies of Alberti, written by Vasari, an Italian biographer of just a few years after Alberti's, of the 16th century, and discovers all kinds of wonderful things about Alberti that make him sound and seem like a truly exceptional person. He could, among other things, with his feet together, spring over a man's head. He could jump so high. He has another passage where he talks about he could throw a coin so it hits the top of the church rafters. But the deepest springs of his nature have yet to be spoken of, the sympathetic intensity with which he entered into the whole life around him. He looks at things and they make him cry. He's more deeply moved than any human being has been so far. He doesn't simply go about his life, living day to day. He takes interest in everything. He prophesies the future. He learns all the disciplines there are to know. He knows everything there is to be known about mathematics and history. He has unquenchable thirst and a desire for life. He is the first person who is truly awake in the world, perhaps, at least as this is evoked by Jacob Burckhardt. I think we get a sense of why this value might be a good thing, why we might aspire to it. Escape the drudgery of your connection to a traditional, old-fashioned world where you have to do what other people tell you to do, we have to be worried about what society thinks. Alberti is the first person who doesn't care, who does whatever he wants, and reinvents the world in the process. This idea of the Renaissance man is very close to our vision of this new Renaissance man of what we'll get to in a moment with the idea of Faust. And above all, this is an interesting claim. This is maybe the most important thing sort of to note about him, as Burckhardt evokes him, citing in Vasari's a biography. An iron will pervaded and sustained his whole personality. Like all the great men of the Renaissance, he said, men can do all things if they want. You notice we see already in this language this notion of an individual, of a person, of a new person, who is only beholden to the law, he, and eventually when we become more enlightened about gender relations, and she give him or herself. And the concluding paragraph, which I don't have here, but I just have in memory, is maybe the most powerful of all, when Burckhardt writes, and I only have sources to write about Leon Battista Alberti. If I had sources, I could tell you things about Leonardo da Vinci that are 10 times as fantastic and great, because Leonardo da Vinci was so much more spectacular a human personality than was Alberti. The question here is not, again, whether Leon Battista Alberti was really like this. We're not debating the factual merits of these claims. What we're looking for is the mythological origins of the notion that Europe is and should be spectacular. And also we're trying to answer the question, how should Europe be spectacular? And these kinds of texts give answers to these questions. When you do your close readings, I noted to you that we'll be marking them really on a really simple scale. 0 for not having done it or missed the assignment, 1, and 2 for having done it sort of in an exceptional way. But what makes an exceptional post or close reading in this case is your ability to pose a question that your text can handle. You can't ask questions of text that they're not equipped to handle. You can't ask about things that fall entirely outside it. That's one danger. And it's also no point in asking an obvious question, like, what is the first word of the text? That's not a kind of question that can generate a good close reading. A good close reading has to come from something that's not immediately obvious, but that the text can actually help you to answer. And one question this text helps us to answer, if we read it from the right perspective, is how the vision of the European individual and the value of the European individual is created and formed, and what that value means. A close reading of these words shows us that the vision of the new man, the new individual, is somebody who has all of these intellectual powers and capacities, some physical powers and capacities, an enormous curiosity, and above all, an iron will, and is able to determine on his or her own terms the kind of life he or she would like to lead. I hope you see how this all connects back into Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid, It Melts into Air, and the idea of modernity as a world in which we become the subjects and the objects of our own development. This is an answer to that question. Close reading is always about trying to find the right question for the fact that you happen to have at hand. It's thinking backwards. You have a text. You have the answer in your hand, but you have to find the question. The skill of close reading is about moving in that opposite direction. Taking something you might have always known, a fact, a writing, and finally seeing the question that this text is an answer to. Now, this idea of a new person, a new man, a new humanity is something that starts proliferating from the time of the Renaissance onward. And it reaches its apogee or its culmination really in the Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And I want to point out simply one little circle of people who are preoccupied with this question. Lord Byron, famous English poet, who is certainly in some ways embodied too this ideal. He was rather comfortable in his own bisexuality. He had amorous relationships with both men and women. He developed close friendship with Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley's a wife and the ultimate author of one of the most important works of the age. I want to point out to you that the ideal of friendship is also part of modernity. Friendship itself is about chosen connections to other human beings, as opposed to ethnic or family connections. The past, ethnic and family connections are inherited from the past. But friendship is entirely voluntary. It's about your iron will deciding what's important to you. The people in your life you choose as friends are not people you have to be related to. The people who come from your past, to your connection to a race, your connection to an ethnic group, your connection to a family, are people you have to kind of interact with. But friendship becomes, again, a big watchword in this period, and this aspiration to create a life that is fully self-determined. Byron ends up dying in 1824, fighting for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. He lived his life many ways in the spirit of the modern age. He made his own choices. He wasn't fighting for English independence. He chose a different nationality to fight for, because he saw the Greek struggle against the Ottoman Empire as the place where the cause of human freedom was most importantly challenged in the modern world at the moment. These chosen associations and affiliations are a big part of this Romantic age and the new humanity that comes with it. Percy Bysshe Shelley is perhaps famous for this quote I put at the bottom, and perhaps the one that connects us to political science, lest we forget that we're in the Schritte department here, that poets are in fact the unacknowledged legislators of the world. What does that mean? That if you want to know politics, you should study poetry and not policy. Because it's poets who actually change the mentalities of people. It's the poets who make the most important political shifts and changes in the world, who create the mentalities that become important in the larger world. He produced a book titled, or a poem, Prometheus Unbound, where he kind of takes on this problem of a human being trying to defy the gods and create a new world order sort of on his own. But no one, perhaps, of these three was more important or more influential than Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the daughter of one of the first famous English feminists, when she wrote Frankenstein as an 18-year-old, published it at the age of 20, subtitled The Modern Prometheus. This takes on more explicitly than anyone else the idea of inventing a new humanity. Is it possible through science to put science and poetry together and create a new human being? This doesn't work out so well in the story. But the promise or the idea of changing, transforming humanity is fundamental to the undertakings of all three, and perhaps has remained with us in the most spectacular way in the writings of Mary Shelley. It's a good place also, we don't have time to go into this deeply into this work, to think about the relationship between science and humanity, or the European attitude towards science as a way of understanding the world, but then also a way of transforming the world once we have understood it. Some scholars claim that Frankenstein is the first work of science fiction in world history. And it is, in many ways, the first attempt to write entirely in the spirit of the Romantic age about a world and a possibility that does not yet exist. If there's anything more fundamental to the Romantic age, I don't know what it is. The idea that the best of times and our greatest values lie, in some sense, in the future, in our revolutions, our development, and ultimately our democracy. Now, these myths of development, of transformation, creating a new humanity, from the Renaissance really up until the Romantic period, two images prevail. I've already introduced you to Prometheus, and the myth of Prometheus as the man who stole fire from the gods and was punished for it by being chained to a stone. This notion of acting against the authorities, fighting against the powers that be, is fundamental to all of these kind of visions of development and the making of a new humanity. But I want to turn now and focus more on another story that sometimes gets forgotten, but is perhaps even more profoundly important to this idea of a new man, a new humanity, and the European myth of modernity. And that is the story of Faust. What Prometheus and Faust have in common is that both preoccupied, or they're both, the significance of these two stories is about the relationship of the individual to society and the possibility of transforming both for the sake of freedom and power, and ultimately the creation of a new humanity. But Faust, unlike Prometheus, as far as we can tell, was an actual historical figure. He was an alchemist, an astrologer of the late Renaissance Germany, who lived from 1480 to 1540, and was very interested in questions about how to gain scientific control over creation. Beginning already in the 16th century, Faustian stories started proliferating around Europe. There's probably no part of Europe that didn't have its own version of the Faust story. One of the earliest high cultural printed version was Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare, who in 1604 wrote the story of Faust. But Faust captivated people as somebody who defies, again, the conventional expectations of the day and tries to create something new and better, and transforms himself in the process. Now, in the old version of the story, what's ultimate and most important here is the pact with the devil. He sells his soul to the devil in order to transform, to gain this greater knowledge over the world. And this remains central or important, ultimately, in Goethe's version of the story. Like Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, friendship was crucial to the sort of German romantic context in which this contemplation of a new man and a new humanity happened. The friendship of Schiller and Goethe is a famous one, and it commemorated in the Goethe-Schiller monument in Weimar. I include some of these pictures just so you get a sense of how Weimar, the city of Weimar, where this friendship happened, where these ideas about reinventing humanity happened, is very much like Tartu. A small kind of German-style town with a couple of churches at the center, perhaps not close to a border in the same way that Tartu is with Russian civilization, but with many of the same internal dynamics. A kind of fear of its own backwardness, a sense of its own marginality, not being at the most important part of Europe or the most important part of the world. It's not a Paris or a London for sure. It's in this environment, then, that some of the greatest works about this question were written. Schiller is in some ways, and even more for his much shorter life, a resonant figure even in the notion of a revolutionary path to modernity. The words of his Ode to Joy have become the words of the European anthem when Beethoven used them as such. And he coined such phrases as the disenchantment of the world to describe how the world was changing and moving in the making of a modern world. But his first important novel, or play rather, The Robbers, is all about the inequalities of the age and the attempt to create a better society, partly through improving the humanity. Goethe's Faust ultimately became, you could say, the ultimate expression of this aspiration. And when you think about, when you do your reading for this week, and you think about Shadaev and Kirevsky, I hope you will also think about the way in which Goethe's Faust sets the agenda for European modernity. This is one reason why doing a close reading of precisely this work is so valuable. And of course, you don't have to do the close reading yourself. Marshall Berman does it for you. But think about why Marshall Berman titles this chapter, The Tragedy of Development. What is the tragedy of development? That a lot of good things need to be left behind. Okay, great. Okay, this is one element in the idea of the tragedy of development. In creating a better world, a world where we become the subjects and objects of our own development, where we have all those abilities that Leon Battista Alberti had, we have to actually give up a lot. Maybe that's why it's tragic. Anything else?
Development always has an unexpected price.
that development always has an unexpected price. Yes, I think. And a price that perhaps we don't want to pay. Like what? What might be the unexpected price of development? I didn't hear. Tranquility and stability, we lose these things. Yes, okay, it's tranquility and stability and old values that perhaps family. Same things, basically. If modernity is about constant change and transformation, it's about never being able to sit still. It's about being moving. And if you value the right or ability simply to sit still and quietly smell the flowers, this is something that perhaps modernity does not accord you. Let's look a little bit more closely at how Goethe builds up this problem. When we talk about the casualties of modernity, there's a key figure, and look at the end of the chapter and read this section carefully. It comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is, of course, the Roman poet, but it's the story of a sweet old couple. I don't remember if it's page 67 or 68 or something like that, but we have Philemon and Baucis. Do you remember the story of Philemon and Baucis if you've read the required reading so far? What is their story, as Marshall Berman tells it? Okay, I have to paraphrase what you said because, but that was wonderful. I mean, the idea that there is this old couple that live in a territory that Faust wants to develop. Faust is, among other things, a developer. He wants to develop the land, to make it productive, to make it better than it was. And this old couple who lives there, in the story of this painting, which comes from is a painting of Ovid's Metamorphoses, we see that the old couple here, pictured on the right, are visited by two Greek gods. Maybe you know who those gods are if you look at the picture. We have Mercury and Jupiter, or Zeus, right? And they are so kind and so hospitable to Mercury and Jupiter that they are rewarded with all kinds of gifts. But in the retelling of this story of the sweet old couple, Faust has to get rid of them, because they don't want to move out of their house. He's willing to offer them money. He's willing them to help them move, but they don't want to move. They want to say, this is our land. And ultimately, Faust doesn't want to hurt them, but he asks the devil, Mephistopheles, to get them out of the way. It's worth reading about how this is evoked, and how Faust in the end says he's surprised when he learns that Mephistopheles has basically executed. I didn't want this, and Mephistopheles tells him, but you asked for it. Here we have one of the fundamental questions of modernity. Who's to blame? Who is responsible? When the developer comes into town and says, we want to make the world better for everybody. We don't want to hurt anyone. We want to build a paper factory here in Tartu. It will create more jobs. We want to create a more productive society. Who is the hero and who is the traitor? When we say yes to this, are we saying yes to Europe, to development, to modernity, to everything good? Or can we say no and still claim to be, in some sense, European? This dilemma or this problem, you could say, is at the root of all of European history. To look a little bit more closely just at the story, I want to point out one or two things here. First of all, that like Europe and Russia, Faust is born in translation. The very first thing we see him doing in the story is trying to translate the Bible into German. He's struggling with that very first word, or the very first sentence. In the beginning was the... What is it in the Bible, ultimately? Word. But he's not sure that this is the best translation. Because if you go back to the ancient Hebrew, you find that it's not as clear as we think if we have in the beginning was the Word, we've gotten that through Latin. But these are all mistranslations out of Greek. So he's playing with trying to get at a more original, more fundamental, more accurate verbal beginning. He says he plays around with other possible words. He says maybe it wasn't in the beginning was the deed, or in the beginning was the power, or in the beginning was the, and all of a sudden we're lost in this welter of words. And we see that kind of confusion, that sense of marginality, inability to perform in the larger world, and a sense of kind of boredom and ennui that he cannot overcome. You see his futility, his despair. He's on the brink of suicide, and then he gets visited by Mephistopheles, and he hears church bells ringing, and he makes the famous Faustian pact with the devil. He exchanges his soul for infinite knowledge, infinite power, and basically eternal life, so long as he keeps moving and developing and changing. And we see the story unfold as he fights against stasis, right? He has to keep moving. If I stand fast, I shall be a slave. Marshall Berman quoting Faust here on page 50. You see modernity's obsession with moving forward. And the way Marshall Berman tells us the story, at least, we see this unfolding through three metamorphoses, three transformations, three kind of major changes. Faust becomes a dreamer again. He starts imagining a better world, a better future. Then he becomes a lover. And we see some of the tragedy of development, of course, in the consequences of his love affair with Gretchen. And finally, he becomes the developer. And his ultimate aim, his ultimate task is to turn a swamp into a city, to take an unproductive piece of land that doesn't serve anybody's interest and to turn it into something that benefits all of mankind. We can see in this narrative, in this plot, the story of Europe as a whole. You first have to become a dreamer, then you have to become a lover, and then you have to become a developer. And basically, when we look into European history, we see this sequence in a number of different places and in a number of different forms. So the first part of this lecture, which I had just concluded for you, was to introduce you to the idea of the new man and to the need for a new humanity in order to make the world better in the name of modernity. I wanted to show how the concept of modernity, which we introduced last time, is dependent, at least partly, on the transformation of humanity. And that this idea of a new man is as old as the Renaissance. It's not something the Soviet Union invented, or other parts of Europe later on. Now, in the second part and third parts of this lecture, I want to look a little bit at the historical, you could say, this historical developments behind all this, first in Europe and then in Russia. And culminating with this idea that perhaps, as a historical figure, Napoleon, the first great Napoleon, is in some ways the first Faustian figure in world history, born of the revolutionary process of creating modernity. When the German philosopher Friedrich Hegel saw Napoleon ride into town in Jena on October 13th, 1806, he wrote in his diary that he had seen the world spirit on horseback. What was it about Napoleon that seemed to grasp on the turn of the 19th century for so many people the vision of a new, empowered human being, a new kind of person who was going to reinvent the world and make it better? Even his enemies marveled at him. In many ways, Russian and European literature throughout the 19th century are all commentaries on Napoleon. What is Tolstoy's War and Peace? It's a book about Napoleon. It's a book about the War of 1812 and how Napoleon seems to embody for so many Russians as well as Europeans this vision of a new Europe and a new society. But Napoleon was attractive, you could say, in this period of revolution at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, because he seemed to be entirely a self-made man. He came from very secondary, marginal origins. He too was marginal, like Europe was at the beginning. He came from the island of Corsica, an island most people had never heard of. He spoke French with a very strong Corsican accent. He wasn't particularly educated. He was a member of the Corsican nobility, But who's heard of Corsica? He wasn't part of the French mainland nobility. And yet he became the most powerful and most known person in the entire world. This story of the possibility of making oneself powerful beyond compare, you can see, achieves its fruition in the historical figure of Napoleon. But to understand sort of how Napoleon becomes such a powerful figure, we have to look just a little bit, and I've actually condensed many years of thought into this one slide here. So let's see if we can keep this simple. We have to understand the revolutionary circumstances out of which he was born. Modernity begins, you could say, with a new conception of time in Europe. A new conception of time where the circle meets the line. If most societies in world history, most traditional societies, have envisioned time as moving in a circle, they see a world in which people are born and die into the same environment. That your death is in the same community as your birth. And you are buried in a churchyard, or depending in other traditions and other kind of graveyards with your ancestors. But the accelerating pace of change in the 18th century makes it impossible to continue to envision time as a circle. Yes, we still have the seasons. The world keeps on turning. And yet things are changing so much that the world in which people die is no longer the world in which they were born. And they start to see that. Say modernity really begins in the moment when it becomes perceptible in people's individual lives that the world is changing around them. Up until 1700, you can believe that the world is basically static. Things are changing, but you don't see it in your own lifetime. If there's a watershed, it's around 1700 at the beginning of the 18th century, because it's now that change becomes visible. It's accelerated and becomes particularly visible by the Industrial Revolution. And it's right around this time, right at the beginning of the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, that the word modern comes into European discourse. What brings the word modern has been there before, but it becomes a concept and a problem in a very kind of arcane debate in the French Academy. The Académie Française starts debating about poetry. And the question is, are the ancient poets better than the modern ones? This might be the first time when modernity or modern is used in the sense that we kind of understand it today, as a value, as something that and what's at stake in this debate is, do we need to keep on going back to ancient values, or can we create something new that is better? This is also the moment where the word progress is invented. Progress, again, in the modern sense of improving things, making things better. I can't emphasize enough for you that if we have to kind of defamiliarize for ourselves words that we use every day, words that we take as for granted as being values, progress, modernity. The question I'm asking you to consider is, how did these become values in the first place? And the answer I'm suggesting lies somewhere at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. That if we go back before then, we won't see people appealing to the idea of progress. We won't see people appealing to the idea of modernity, because those aren't yet values. You don't talk about a good life in those terms. But starting at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, the notion of changing the world becomes a good thing, a positive thing, a value. Something that we start to see that's made possible by these new men, or the cultural concept of the new men, like Leon Battista Alberti, people who are struggling for a better world. Of course, even the Renaissance itself was conceived in reference to the past. What does the word Renaissance mean? Rebirth. So the Renaissance, as a cultural concept, was not about creating a new world. It was about remembering an old one. In the course of trying to remember an old one, though, the new became a value. Now we see the term revolution applied to a lot of things that happened in this period, in the 17th and 18th century, the scientific revolutions, the English Revolution, which culminated first in a Puritan dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. But here it's important to emphasize how the word revolution itself changed its meaning. When we study the past, we have to pay attention to the words that are used, but also to the way those words change their meaning. What is a revolution? In the original sense, it's actually a circle. It's a rotation. How many times you can say, how many times does something revolve? Does it go in a circle? It's in this period, though, that the circular definition of revolution is replaced with a linear one. And revolution becomes an unprecedented change that takes you to a place you've never been before. The word revolution itself comes to mean something new. No longer simply a rotation or a repetition of the past, but now an unprecedented change moving us forward. In many cases, the use of these terms is retrospective. Nobody living in the 17th century would say, I'm living in the scientific revolution. But by the time we get to the 18th and 19th centuries, the word revolution is everywhere. People think in terms of revolutions in this new sense. It's really the French Revolution, above all revolutions, that gives this new meaning to the word and allows us to look back at the previous century as a period of revolutions. Eric Hobsbawm, the famous English historian, actually gave a very concise and useful evocation of the dual revolution of the 18th century, the making of modernity, in two places. First, the Industrial Revolution that he associated with England, where we really see the problem of development, first and foremost. And then the French Revolution, in France, at the end of the century, where democracy comes to the fore. If we're thinking about the two values that seem to mark modernity. And perhaps that's most of what we need to say about the origins of this revolutionary sensibility. Maybe the point of this slide was to kind of tell you a little bit, or get you thinking about how revolution becomes a value, how it changes its meaning from a circular to a kind of a linear sense, how it becomes part of this larger story of making a new humanity, a new society, and part of the project of a new individual. Now, in the French Revolution, if we think about, and this is really useful and helpful, I think, for thinking about how European modernity is really seen as happening in two places, and we combine the two often in our imagination. A British story that's really based on the Industrial Revolution, the economic story, the story of development, and then the French story, the political story of creating all these new values and sensibilities, liberty, equality, fraternity, as the great values of the French Revolution. And we imagine that a modern world has to have both of these things. It has to have economic development and it has to have political democracy, and somehow it's possible to put those two things together, that they do not contradict each other. The outcome of all of this in the 18th century, of course, was the rise of Napoleon, the figure that haunts the 19th century. I want to look just a little bit more closely here in this slide. This slide here takes us a little bit more deeper into the French Revolution. It would be useful to have a sense of the major stages in it, because these, in some sense, haunt us to today, and they help us then tell the story of modernity in the 19th century thereafter. The two questions that you say that anybody should be interested in who hears about the French Revolution are these two. Why does the French Revolution, once it starts, radicalize and end up killing so many people and leading to so much human suffering and casualties? And how does it produce the rise of a man like Napoleon? I think those are the two enduring questions of the French Revolution that linger on in all disciplines outside of French history as well. We have here two images of Napoleon, and you might think about how these two images represent Napoleon differently. But let's go through just the most basic chronology of the French Revolution. It's really, you can tell it in four stages. The first stage, 1789 to 1792, is the moderate revolution. This attempt to create a new French society that will be no longer an absolutist monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy, limited by the rule of law. The king is not going to be thrown out, but he's going to be severely limited in what he can do. As this proceeds or unfolds, people are not happy with what has happened, and there are a lot of questions raised. The king tries to run away, questions of traitors, enemies of the people, and the revolution radicalizes. And then the new claim is, no, we can't simply have a constitutional monarchy. We need to create a republic that, in the interest of true democracy, having a king at all seems to become a major problem. The Jacobins are those group of French revolutionaries who keep on pushing the revolution to radicalize. And they form, in the period of the Republic, 1792 to 1794, an organization they call the Committee of Public Safety. And this is presided over by the head Jacobin, Maximilien Robespierre, who was perhaps famous as the architect of the French Revolutionary Terror. And in the French Revolutionary Terror, the new invention, the guillotine, is then used to kill tens of thousands of people who are perceived as enemies of the revolution. And perhaps the first place where we really start to see this, the tragedy of development, to use Berman's terms. How this attempt to create a better world, where people become the subjects and the objects of their own development, where they are in charge of their own societies, where they have all the human capacities of a Leon Battista Alberti, where they are more physically powerful, where they are more, you could say, culturally informed, how ultimately this culminates in enormous violence and killing. Tens of thousands of people are killed. And the revolution, in some sense, collapses. And it collapses when Robespierre himself is killed by the Committee of Public Safety and guillotined. The following years, 1794 to 1799, known as the period of the Directory, are a kind of a dismal moment in French revolutionary history. Nothing really is happening. People don't know what direction to go, to take. It's a mess. And it turns out that the only successes France is having in this historical moment are the successes of its foreign conquests under the head of a hitherto unknown general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte is the one good thing at that moment in French history. The one thing that people can rally behind, that can respect. He seems to be, he can't lose. He is actually, his conquests contribute more to French pride than anything else. In 1799, he comes back to Paris and declares himself first consul. He takes over the revolutionary government. And then a few years later, he declares himself emperor of France. And in the rise of Napoleon, we have the great problem that then spans the entirety of the 19th century. What does he actually represent? Is Napoleon the culmination of the revolution, this aspiration to create a better world? Or is he a reactionary rejection of it all? We have two images of Napoleon. Napoleon aboard on horseback here, moving fast across the Alps, constant motion in revolutionary garb and colors, and Napoleon the Emperor after 1802 or 1803. Modern France is in many ways a product of Napoleon. He issues the Civil Code, and he says himself in a rather kind of coy way in the Civil Code, he writes, "We have finished the novel of the revolution." He uses literary metaphors here. "Now we must begin its history, looking only at what is real and possible in the application of its principles, not what is speculative and hypothetical." So here in microcosm, in the French Revolution, culminating in Napoleon, we have pretty much all the problems that are to afflict Europe and Russia over the course of the next 200 years. The problem of this enormous optimism about creating a new world order, and in some sense a new human being where somebody like Napoleon can rise to the top. It seems entirely unprecedented. And at the same time, when that person does in fact arise to the top, it seems like it's a rejection of everything that was aspired to and was desired. And it's presented as the only possible solution. This path from constitutional monarchy to a republic, to the terror, to the Directory, and then to Napoleon, something worth keeping in mind. It will come back. Now I want to turn, for the last part of this lecture, to St. Petersburg, to Russia in general, but St. Petersburg in particular. And just as I wanted to I invited you to think about it and ask yourself, is Napoleon the first historical Faustian individual? Is Petersburg, we could ask, the first great Faustian city? In many ways, Napoleon and Petersburg have a lot in common. They're both born of themselves. They're both self-generated in some sense. Petersburg is a city born in a swamp. And remember how Goethe's Faust ends, trying to create a city out of a swamp. It's not the first city to be born out of a swamp. In fact, Alexander Ritchie, a journalist, has written a fascinating book on Berlin as Faust's metropolis. The city of Berlin, too, is not all that old. It was built in a swamp, and it became a fantastically large city. But St. Petersburg might be even more remarkable, because there was so little there when Peter decides to build the city. Fyodor Dostoevsky has claimed, who was, of course, also an inhabitant of St. Petersburg, that it is the most intentional city in the world. This, of course, is fundamental to the idea of European modernity and to the creation of a new man or a new humanity. Imperial St. Petersburg was founded in 1703, and with it, Peter the Great attempted to set a new beginning for Russian history. As Marshall Berman tells us, it grew much more quickly than any other European city had in the past. By 1730s, it already had over 100,000 inhabitants. By the end of the century, over 200,000. And by the beginning of the 19th century, well over 1 million. And if we look at these vistas we see how much it was built in the European model. And when you start thinking about Chadaev and you start thinking about Kirevsky, remember that these are two figures who spent a lot of time in Petersburg. In many ways, Petersburg is the place, the context, historical context out of which they come. And that it was supposed to be a kind of clean slate for Russian history, to forget all those things that we talked about before, to begin in a very European spirit to create a new order in Russia. In fact, most of the architects were European. In fact, all the architects they were either Dutch, Italian, French, English. They were all called in to help design these buildings. And it was modeled upon the canals of Venice and Amsterdam. In some sense, a copy. In some sense, an attempt to take part in the spirit of modernity, you could say, that Peter kind of noted was just coming into its own in continental Europe. In the year of his death, Peter founded the first great imperial academy by consulting another great European philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz, who suggested how he could build up a system of knowledge. The French language came to dominate the Academy of Sciences until the end of the 19th century. Russia, too, is born in translation, I suggested to you, partly because it struggled with the acknowledgement of Russian as a valid language for science, with a valid language for culture. The French language dominated academic life in St. Petersburg and in Russia at large into the 19th century, if not to the very end. Moreover, the scholars who worked at the Imperial Academy of Sciences were almost, without exception, Europeans. I point out simply a local figure. If you go outside, you'll see his statue here. But Karl Ernst von Baer was one of these scholars, born in the province of Estonia, trained here at Tartu University, who became a corresponding, and actually, no, he lived for a long time in St. Petersburg as well, as one of the kind of members of the Imperial Academy. Think about what this says or what this means. The language of Russian imperial science is French. The architects of the greatest city in Russia are Dutch, Italian, English, and French. The scholars who are creating Russian science are mostly Germans or French. And there's very little room for Russia in Russia. Another academy is born in 1783, the Russian Academy, with the task of actually trying to study and make sense of the Russian language. The first academic dictionary of the Russian language is produced in the year that the French Revolution breaks out, 1789, to really the year that the French Revolution ends, 1794. This need or desire to create a kind of a Russian cultural identity based on Europe, but not overly beholden to it, is the problem of Russian history. The problem that Chadaev articulates in his first philosophical letter, and that Kirevsky then responds to a few decades later. Now, one of the interesting things about St. Petersburg is that it's always been subject to forces of nature. It was built in a swamp. You can never forget this. And a swamp is the least stable place to build a new world order that you can possibly imagine. 3 floods, and people can turn quite superstitious about this, have overwhelmed St. Petersburg, basically at 100-year intervals. The first came in 1725, the year of the founding of the Academy of Sciences. The next in 1825, right after the death, around the time of the death of Alexander I. The next in 1924, around the time of the death of Lenin. Now, if past is prologue and the history predicts something, will there be another great flood in St. Petersburg in 2024 or 2025? Only time will tell. But the sense of a natural world, of the forces of nature, very close at hand, has always been part of the cultural imagination of St. Petersburg as well. The person who gives the greatest expression to this is Russia's national poet, Alexander Pushkin, and his poem of 1833, The Bronze Horseman, A Petersburg Tale. Notice here we have the Bronze Horseman. This is a picture I took of the Bronze Horseman about a year ago in September when I was for a few days in St. Petersburg. The statue itself, you learn a lot about here in the caption below. It represents, and notice the Russian language is not being used here. We have Latin being used to talk about this Russian identity here. Peter I is commemorated, and he's being commemorated by Catherine II, or the Great, the year being 1782. Picture I took, I had somebody take of me lying on the ground to make it look like I was trampled by the Bronze Horseman, which did not actually happen. But if we're looking for a monument that encapsulates or represents the power and the meaning of this city more than any other, it's probably this. In Pushkin's poem, and it's Pushkin's poem partly that calls attention to all of these interesting aspects of the city and the way in which maybe Petersburg becomes this Faustian city, a city about development and transformation of humanity. The poem itself is set, as Marshall Berman tells us, during the 1824-25 flood. And in it we see a kind of exchange of place between water and stone. The city is constantly being besieged by the waves. The waves of the ocean are threatening to envelop or overwhelm the stone. And we have the question here that Marshall Berman tells us about at the very beginning of his book, that all that is solid melts into air. Is the stone more permanent than the water, or is the water more permanent than the stone? They have in some sense changed places in Pushkin's poem. There's a surreal quality to the life of St. Petersburg. Real life, tells us Marshall Berman. And it's actually precisely this that the Tartu University scholar Yuri Lotman observed when he wrote his essay, The Decembrist in Daily Life, here in Tartu. Yuri Lotman became famous in the Soviet Union as perhaps the most important scholar of Pushkin in the realm. And there too he plays with Pushkin's motif, this idea that sometimes fiction and reality change places. That fiction no longer describes reality, it actually sets an agenda for a new reality. If you remember, this is precisely what the new man is all about, and the spirit of modernity, creating an agenda for a new world order, creating a new human being. What we find here finally is a kind of Promethean defiance springing forth from the soul of the oppressed common man. This is part of the spirit of the poem that shows this project of creating a new world order, a new city, a new environment, as something that has a very controversial and very problematic, you could say, meaning for Russian history. Now, behind all of this, I just want to identify 3 leaders to be sort of aware of. We have the Romanov Dynasty. Pushkin's Bronze Horseman is sort of born out of the history that culminates in Alexander I's reign. But the Romanov dynasty, which basically rules Russia for several centuries, from 1613 to 1917, is first kind of marked by Peter the Great and his attempt to found St. Petersburg as a window upon Europe. This relationship with Europe becomes stressed and important here. This relationship with Europe is further deepened by Catherine the Great, Catherine II, who not only builds the bronze horseman statue, but calls all kinds of European thinkers to St. Petersburg and consults them in the development of a nakaz, so kind of a set of rules or a kind of constitution for the Russian state. And at the same time, she participates in the repression of forms of indigenous rebellion, the Pugachev rebellion being the most famous here. Now, Alexander I's reign from 1801 to 1825 is a kind of, has a very mixed legacy. Because one of the things that Alexander is famous for is being the only power in the world to defeat Napoleon. If the big story of the last part of this lecture was about Napoleon's rise to power, the ultimate man who can defeat anyone, the one part of the world he can't defeat is Russia. Russia in 1814 defeats Napoleon. And with it, we see the birth of Russian national pride and a vision that Russia might in some sense be better than Europe. If Napoleon can overturn the kingdoms of Italy and all of Germany and all of Spain and Portugal, but he can't deal with Russia, maybe there is something in Russia worth remembering, worth celebrating, that Russians can be proud of too. The question of where Russia goes becomes a major question after the War of 1812 with the defeat of Napoleon. And many of the intellectuals who start to interpret and make Russia's position in the world are reacting to and talking about this moment, the War of 1812 and the 1814 defeat of Napoleon. One of the first attempts, then, to actually change Russia's identity, position, I mentioned Barclay de Tolly. He's one of the Alexander I generals, another figure who retired to Tartu. You can see his monument here very close by. I'm trying to call attention as we go through this course to local figures and local monuments that you will just see around you, but are deeply connected to the events that we talk about. This is the last point from this slide. You could say in some ways Russia's French Revolution is the Decembrist Revolt of 1825. The Decembrists were a group of aristocrats and intellectuals who were unhappy with the absolutist path of the Russian state, who wanted to believe in the possibility of controlling their own destinies and creating a more democratic society, who really subscribed, you could say, in many ways, to the ideals of modernity, of revolution, of development, and democracy. And their hope was that when Alexander I died, that his very liberal brother, Constantine, would become the next Russian Tsar. They chanted Constantine and Constitution, and they attempted to overthrow the actual Tsar, or rather to create problems for his nomination, Nicholas I. Nicholas I was the very reactionary and conservative brother of Alexander I, who took over for the next several decades, and who symbolizes for Europe and for the world at large the kind of the reaction against, the conservative turn against European modernity. He's associated in most accounts with a kind of a negation of Europe. But in the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, we see the explosion of possible meanings and possible destinies that has been marking Europe all along. Pushkin himself was a great friend of many of the Decembrists, that is, the aristocrats who participated in this revolt. And it was only because Nicholas I liked keeping him around that he wasn't himself put in prison and actually made to suffer for his allegiance. In any case, it's worth noting and remembering that Russian history, imperial history of the 19th century, begins in many ways with a tension between the forces of aristocratic liberal reform and the reaction against that in the form of Nicholas I and his reign. Through all of this, one thing that we have kind of noted is that I've emphasized for you is the extent to which certain parts of Europe, certainly the eastern parts, the German parts, like Russia, are and perceive themselves as severely underdeveloped and backward even. Marshall Berman writes about a split that he sees in Goethe's Faust, a split that is pervasive in European society and that will be one of the primary sources of international romanticism later on. But he claims it has a special resonance in countries that are socially, economically, and politically underdeveloped. German intellectuals in Goethe's age were the first to see their society this way. And when they compared it with England, with France, with expanding America, they saw their own underdevelopment. This underdeveloped identity was sometimes a source of shame, at other times, as in German Romantic conservatism, a source of pride, most often a volatile mixture of both. And it's this kind of German sense of underdevelopment that is both a source of shame and a source of pride that can be seen in the Russian mirror. We think of the relationship between Russia and Europe as a mirroring one in this case. That the problems of Germany are exactly identical in many ways to the problems of Russia. This mixture will next occur, Berman tells us, in 19th century Russia, which we will examine in detail later on. In the 20th century, intellectuals in the Third World, bearers of avant-garde cultures and backward societies, have experienced the Faustian split with a special intensity. Their inner anguish has often inspired revolutionary visions, actions, and creations, as it will for Goethe's Faust. So Goethe's Faust is important to us here as somebody who is really in contradiction with his own time, who is attempting to change the world, but is confronting a world that refuses to be changed. And the dynamics of European and Russian history become about that encounter between a kind of utopian, or at least very optimistic belief in the possibility of changing people individually and collectively, and the resistance to that transformation at the same time. I've introduced you to Alexander Pushkin already, and his association with the Decembrists came from his Ode to Liberty in 1825. This was found with many of the aristocrats who were involved in the opposition to the regime. But Pushkin should be remembered, and I just want to focus on what's here on the left side of the slide. He can be imagined or seen as Russia's Goethe. In fact, Pushkin called Goethe's Faust the Iliad of modern life. They were kind of aware of one another and of one another's place or role in the making of the modern world. The modern world is a place of, this was an era too of the first national poets. England had an old poet, Shakespeare. Italy had an old poet too, Dante. But newer countries, like Germany, which hadn't yet been formed as a political entity or a whole, the Holy Roman Empire doesn't count, did not have their own poets. Russia did not have their own poet. So the poets that become the national poets of Eastern Europe, Adam Mickiewicz, right, becomes the national poet of Poland. But these figures are all born of this historical moment. Again, we see the theme of European, or at least Central and Eastern European marginality, the feeling that we're not good enough, the inferiority complex. We don't have the national poets that Italy and England have. We don't have somebody from the Renaissance to look back to. We have to invent somebody now. Both Goethe and Pushkin, you can say, are born of this fervor to create a new national identity and a new world order. Skip this little part. But there are other people around them, because I want to introduce you to our figures for the assignment this week. Pyotr Judaev is one of these figures. There are many educated noblemen who have very interesting perspectives on the world, even though they aren't, in a direct sense, writers, or first and foremost known as such. He was an educated man. He attended Moscow University, but left in 1812 and went to fight in the Napoleonic Wars. He was in the armies that defeated Napoleon. So he has seen the power of Alexander I and the armies there. And then he went in the 1820s to travel through Europe. He sat in on lectures in German and French universities. He became deeply acquainted with the world outside of Russia. This intertwined world, the transformed world, becomes apparent to us in Judaev. He becomes a friend of the liberal-minded, radical-minded, even Alexander Pushkin. And in the philosophical letters he started to publish right in the late 1820s, this problem of Russia's position in the world starts to afflict him in a very deep way. But this is a man who has fought in Alexander's armies, who's traveled to Europe, who sat in on the lectures of the major intellectuals of the day. Now he's come back to Russia, and he's asking, who are we? Where are we going? He was both a national celebrity and declared clinically insane, and maybe those two things go together. One of the best accounts of Chadaev comes from another intellectual of the day, born in 1812, I believe, Alexander Herzen, sometimes known as the father of Russian socialism. We talk about combined worlds. He was the illegitimate son of a Russian nobleman and a German Protestant woman. One of the most important Russian intellectuals of the 19th century, but born of the fusion of these two worlds. He left Russia in 1847, lived in exile in Europe, lived most of the rest of his life in London, actually. Maybe he became a European, you might say, where he met Marx and where they studied together they studied the problems of socialism, though with only a kind of distant relationship to one another. But Alexander Herzen, in his memoirs, I think, in a moving way, sort of expresses Chadaev's position in Russia toward the end of his life. Chadaev's melancholy and peculiar figure stood out sharply like a mournful reproach. This is such beautiful prose that it's worth, of course it's difficult English too, but it's worth spending some time with. Chadaev's melancholy and peculiar figure stood out sharply like a mournful reproach against the faded and dreary background of Moscow high life. I liked looking at him among the tawdry aristocracy, feather-brained senators, gray-headed scapegraces, and venerable non-entities. However dense the crowd, he stood with folded arms by a column, by a tree on the boulevard, in drawing rooms and theaters, at the club, as in an embodied veto, a living protest, gazing at the vortex of faces senselessly whirling around him. He became whimsical and eccentric, held himself aloof from society, yet could not leave it altogether. Chadaev's position is the position of Russia, more largely, in the 19th century. Wanting change, not knowing how to produce it, trying to imagine, standing apart and yet within that society at the same time. Yvonne Kirevsky was a little bit younger. His father died healing soldiers in Napoleon's invasion of Russia. He also attended Moscow University. He also traveled to Europe. He went in 1828 and returned in 1832. His European travels took him to the lectures of Schelling and Schleiermacher, Hegel and Michelet. But he derived the opposite conclusion from Chadaev. If Chadaev saw despair and hopelessness in Russia's lack of an identity, lack of a past, lack of an identity, Yvonne Kirevsky was one of the first to try to turn this into a source of positive identity. Everything that we don't have, everything that Europe has that we don't have, should not be a source of our shame, should be a source of pride. We don't have rational individualism, he said. We don't emphasize the individual, but we have sobornost, a sense of our collective power, a sense of our community, a sense of our kind of religious commitment to a community and cause. He was one of the two great co-founders of the Slavophile movement. I have only one more slide for you here, and I want to finish on this. It's a quote from Alexander Herzen, who tells us how we can think about the future of Russian history through these figures. Chadaev and the Slavophiles, that is, including Kirevsky, alike stood facing the unsolved sphinx of Russian life, the sphinx sleeping under the overcoat of the soldier and the watchful eye of the Tsar. They alike were asking, what will come of this? To live like this is impossible. The oppressiveness and absurdity of the present situation is obvious and unendurable. Where is the way out? In the 1830s, the great debate of 19th century intellectual Russian life begins. It's known as the Westernizer Slavophile debate. It's a debate that actually metastasizes around the entire globe. Pretty much every country has its own version of it eventually, but I think Russia is the first place that gets it. At stake in the debate is, do we want to be like Europe? How much do we want to be like Europe? How much do we want to take on the Western values? And how much do we want to emphasize our own Slavic indigenous origins? And the answer, of course, was both. But people died and lived and fought over that question over the course of the next century, and you say, in many ways, up until today. So today's lecture was an attempt to give you kind of an account of how the Faustian promise of modernity, the development of a modern individual, how it transforms Europe from really 1700 to the birth of Napoleon, and how that problem or question of creating a new and better world order comes to Russia, and how it culminates in the 1830s in the Westernizer and Slavophile debate. So I'll just leave you with these 4 questions to think about for next week for a discussion, but maybe also will help you with your posting. Be able to answer these for yourself. What is the tragedy of development? How is Goethe's Faust the story of European modernity? What's wrong with Russia, according to Chudayev? And what's wrong with Europe, according to Kirevsky? If you wanted to kind of make sense of everything we've talked about today, being able to answer these questions would be a sign that, yes, you're more or less on top of things. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.